All right, we're back, and we now focus on HTML, hypertext markup language, which is the language in which web pages are written. It is not a programming language, and as such, we won't need to spend all that much time on it because the basics of HTML are fairly straightforward, even though it has a decently large vocabulary, different features that you'll pick up invariably over time. What HTML does have fundamentally are what are called tags and attributes. These are the basic building blocks of the language, and what the language looks like is this. So here is perhaps the simplest web page that I could come up with, a hello world web page, if you will, and it's just text. It is text that's typically stored in a file, like index.html for short, and in that file would just be these lines of code. And these lines here are going to indicate to the browser what it should do upon receipt of an envelope containing this message. Now, how are we going to go about serving up this content? Well, ultimately, we just need to put this content on an actual web server. Well, it turns out you already have a web server, even though you haven't been using it as such. In other words, when you visit cs50.dev and use VS Code in the cloud, you're obviously using a browser, but you're less obviously using a web server that is serving up a copy of VS Code to you in that browser. But the caveat there is that by default, you've probably been in the habit of typing cs50.dev, enter, and you've probably noticed, if not prior to today, after today, that the full URL ends up being https://cs50.dev/ and then maybe some other stuff after that. But implicit in that URL is one of those port numbers that we saw in TCP, either 80 or 443. Because it's HTTPS, it's actually the latter, 443, which indicates implicitly that there must be a server on cs50.dev that is listening for requests and is serving up that version of VS Code. In fact, we eventually redirect you to GitHub's version of VS Code, aka code spaces, but the idea is the same. And in that URL, you have a web page that's being served up to you, but it's already running on port 443 and perhaps 80. Which is to say, if we want to come up with our own web server, we could start up our own server, connect it to the internet, give it an IP address, and then communicate with it using port 80 or 443, but it's actually a lot simpler to embrace the reality that any server can have multiple services, be it web or email or video conferencing or the like, or heck, 2 different web servers. And so even though VS Code in the cloud is already running a web server, because that's indeed how it works, there's nothing stopping you and me from inside of VS Code starting a second web server, so long as we choose a different port number, a different TCP port that's not already being used by the server itself. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to introduce you to a new command today, called quite appropriately http-server. This is a command that you can run in your terminal window that will start your very own web server by default on port 8080. 8080 isn't that special, but it tends to be a convention. Whenever you want to run a web server on a port other than 80 by default, you would just use 8080 as a go-to. But it could really be any number within a large range. Now, this http server command is going to allow me to serve up some actual content. What might that content be? Well, let me go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and run code index.html, and let me go ahead and whip up a very simple web page herein. And I'll explain in just a moment what these lines are, but let me go ahead and just kind of transcribe it in this here file. So angle bracket, exclamation point, doc type, HTML, close bracket. Then I had HTML lang equals quote unquote en. Then I had head. Then I had title. And inside of that title, I had hello, comma, title. Below that head, I had open tag body, inside of which I had hello body. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on here if you've never seen this before, but I think I have recreated the file you just saw in slide form a moment ago. What I'm now going to do is try to view this file inside of my browser. But to do that, I need to do this. I'm going to go ahead and run HTTP server, enter, and a whole bunch of stuff is going to appear in my terminal window, some diagnostic output, a URL, and the like. But in particular, I'm going to get this little pop-up that's telling me, oh, my application running on port 8080 is now available. This is just a user-friendly feature of VS Code, specifically CS50's own extension therein, that allows me to click Open in Browser. I immediately get a second tab inside of which I see the contents of my code space at this moment in time. Now notice, to save myself some time today, I've downloaded in advance a source 8 folder, inside of which are a lot of today's examples, if I so need them. And there's a file I literally just created called index.html. What you're seeing here is a directory index of my current folder. So this is a dynamically, automatically generated web page that's simply showing me in a web browser what is inside of my code space. Now, what's my URL? Well, it turns out it's going to be something that ends in github.dev, which is a domain that GitHub itself controls. So that's going to be generated for me automatically. It's not a domain name I had to buy or sign up for. And it's really meant to be temporary because I'm going to use my code space as a development environment to develop web pages. But most important for now is that indeed this server program is running on localhost, which is a nickname for the local computer, no matter what its actual name is, specifically on port 8080. And this is why I'm now seeing my folder instead of VS Code. This tab has port 8080. This tab would appear to have port 443, which is GitHub's own web server running at this domain. Now I'm going to go ahead and click my index.html. And we will see what the simplest web page in the world might look like. And voila, there is my hello body, which is the only thing in this otherwise big white rectangular region, otherwise known as the viewport of my browser. And if I zoom in at the top here, you'll see that my title of my tab is indeed what we saw earlier, hello, comma, title. So long story short, even if you're completely new to developing web pages, clearly we have the ability with this language called HTML to indicate what the title of a page should be in its tab and what the contents of its body should be, as underwhelming and as black and white as all of this might be. Well, let me go back to my sample code here, and let's now actually introduce some building blocks herein. So what is actually going on? The first line of code that I typed, that you see highlighted here, is the page's so-called document type declaration. That's a silly mouthful, but it's really just a standardized line of text that says, hey browser, here comes a web page written in HTML. Specifically version 5 of HTML, which is what most of the world is now using. Odds are this line of code will change over time, but for now, this is what we have. Below that, things get a little more interesting and a little more symmetric, if you will, and no more exclamation points like you see in this first line. That's a bit of an anomaly. Down here, you'll see what I'll describe as open bracket, HTML, then the space, then lang equals quote unquote en, then close bracket. And by open and close bracket, I mean a less than sign and a greater than sign, respectively, which you can type on your keyboard. What this is doing is the following. This is the beginning of an HTML element, as we might call it, and the tag here for this element is called HTML. So anything immediately after a less than sign is the name of the tag. And the way that browsers work is by relying on these tags to know what to do and where within the confines of the browser. So you can think of this first tag as saying, hey browser, here comes some HTML. Now, what is that HTML all about? Well, this thing here highlighted, lang, short for language, indicates what human language is presumably going to be used throughout the rest of the page. All of the tags, all of the attributes, for better or for worse, are going to be in English because the language HTML itself was standardized by English-speaking people. You can write web pages with your own content in any human language. In this case, I have opted to write my page, as simple as it is, in English as well. Hello title and hello body. And the en attribute value here, so to speak, is just like a clue to the browser that in case you've got Google Translate or any kind of automatic translation, this is a little hint as to what the human language is to facilitate automatic translation or search engine optimization, SEO, or the like. But that whole thing started the HTML page. Now we have a sequence of other tags. Hey browser, here comes the head of the page, which metaphorically is like the very top of the page here, aka the tab that we looked at a moment ago. Hey browser, here comes the title of my page. What's the title? The title is hello, comma, title. Now things are a little weird. The next line of text here is open bracket / title close bracket. And whereas therefore I might call the previous tag the open tag or the start tag, this one here now would be the close tag or the end tag. So there's a symmetry here that effectively is conveying to the browser, hey browser, that's it for the title. The title is now complete. What comes next? Hey browser, that's it for the head of the web page. Nothing left in there. What comes next? Hey browser, here comes the body of the web page, sort of everything else. The big contents of that white rectangular region is the so-called body of the page. Hey browser, here's the contents of the body. Hey browser, that's it for the body. Hey browser, that's it for the HTML itself. Now notice the / indicates the end tag or the close tag, and you don't need to be super verbose. Even though my HTML tag started with a language attribute lang equals quote unquote en, you don't need to repeat the lang, you don't need to repeat the quotes or the en. It's sort of obvious to the browser that this is closing the previously opened HTML tag. Now, in general, the tags you're seeing should exist in one and only one place. You must use these tags in certain locations. We will soon see bunches of other tags that you can use 0 or more times to structure the actual contents of your own page. So how do we get into that, and what are we ultimately doing? Well, what we really have is, in this HTML code, a textual representation of a tree. One of our now familiar data structures, whereby there's a root of this tree that has some number of children, that might have some number of grandchildren, and so forth. And so depicted here at right is what you might call a document object model, or DOM, D-O-M for short, which is actually what the browser is probably doing in its own memory, or RAM, when it accesses a web page. In other words, if you type in google.com and hit enter, you immediately see the contents of Google's website in your browser. What Google has probably done is sent text that looks kind of like this, but more complicated than this simple example. That text is read top to bottom, left to right by your browser and loaded somehow into memory using malloc or other techniques like that to create bunches of nodes in memory with a lot of pointers that somehow represent this tree structure in the computer's memory so that it actually knows what to display on the screen. So with that said, let me go back here to VS Code, and I'm going to go do a sequence of examples now, and I'm going to go back to the code and then back to my browser to show you exactly what's going on. Recall that at this moment in time, the only two things I have are a source 8 folder, which I came with by default today in advance in case I need to copy paste anything, and index.html, which I just created for the first time. So let me go back to my VS Code tab here, and you'll notice that in my terminal window, there's actually a bunch of logging information, diagnostic information. Long story short, anytime anyone visits a web server with a browser, odds are the server is logging that visit. In fact, this is how companies know. This is how internet service providers know. This is how parental controls know what websites you are visiting, because all of this information is going back and forth between browser and server. Here, because I am running the server via that HTTP server command, I now get access to all of this juicy information, including what the browser is that the user is using, what day and time they visited my page, and so forth. But for the sake of discussion, I'm not going to really care about this diagnostic information. I'm going to hide this for the most part. But notice too under ports now, whereas previously I only had one TCP port in use, 1337, which is CS50 specific. Now notice that VS Code has detected that I'm running something else on port 8080. So you see a second port there, and you might, over time, if you open more and more tabs, see even additional ports as well. That all happened for you automatically. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and hide my terminal window because I don't really care what's going on there, but that's still going to keep HTTP server for me running in the background. Let's go ahead and introduce some new tags. So for instance, let me go ahead and create a new file. Actually, let me retract that. Let me open my terminal window, and instead of showing the log, let me create a second terminal window with the plus icon. So I'm still running the other one with the command, but I still have the ability to run commands now in my here prompt. For instance, I want to run a command, code paragraphs.html. Let's go ahead and create a more interesting web page with actual paragraphs of English or other type of text. To save myself some keystrokes, I'm going to be in the habit today of copying the hello world example as a starting point perhaps, and then just changing it as needed. For instance, I'm going to change the title of this here page to paragraphs, and then in here, I'm going to type out some paragraphs of text. Now, what are those paragraphs? Well, I wanted to save some time. So in advance, I generated some Latin-like text here so I can copy paste 3 long paragraphs of Latin text, some lorem ipsum text here. Now, it doesn't matter what this means. It's sort of nonsensical words, but this is a web page that is going to have ultimately some paragraphs of text. Not English, but fake Latin. So let's go ahead and open this. Let me go back to my other tab. I do need to reload this tab because I've created a new file that this browser didn't know about before. There it is, paragraphs.html. Let me go ahead and click now, paragraphs.html, and there are my 3 paragraphs. Well, wait a minute. This is just like one big blob of a paragraph instead of the 3 paragraphs that I was promised. Well, why is that? Well, let me go back to my editor here, and you'll see that even if I hide my terminal here, even though I've got these blank lines, clearly the browser is just ignoring me. And this is because HTML is pretty pedantic. Like, it is designed to only do what you tell it to do. And so if you don't tell it explicitly, give me a new paragraph, it's just going to combine adjacent texts as we've seen already. So how do I do this? It's actually pretty simple. Let me go into my body tag and let me actually open a paragraph tag, or P for short. Now notice VS Code is trying to be helpful by automatically completing the rest of this thought by giving me both a start tag and an end tag. In this case, that's not really helpful because I already have the text that I want to put inside of this paragraph. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the close tag manually, and I'm going to move over here and close this myself. And just to be stylistically nice, I'm going to go ahead and indent that. Now down here, I'm going to do one more paragraph tag, P for short. I'm going to cut that out, and I'm going to paste this in here. And again, I'm fighting with the auto formatting because it is trying to understand what I intend, even though I'm going back and fixing this now. Let me fix that. Let me go down here. Let me go ahead and fix this now. Indent here, and voila. Now we've got 3 paragraph elements. And to be clear, an HTML element is generally everything between a start tag and an end tag. So I have 3 paragraph elements, P for short. Why is it only P? Well, the designers of the HTML language years ago decided, why write out paragraphs when open bracket P, close bracket suffices? So let's now go back to my other tab. If I now, I see nothing changed, but again, that's because I already received the virtual envelope in my browser that contained the previous version of that page. If I want to get a new copy of paragraphs.html, I need to reload this tab, and now I see the same text, but broken down into 3 separate paragraphs. So this is just to demonstrate the point that if you want something to happen, you really need to tell the browser to do exactly that. Well, let's introduce some other tags too. Let me go back to my editor here. Let me go ahead and open my terminal window, and let's create something called headings.html. Much like a book, much like an academic paper, you might have section headings, like the chapter and the section and the subsection and so forth. We can actually implement this with some HTML too. So let me kind of cut a corner here and copy and paste paragraphs.html into headings.html. Let me hide my terminal window. Let me change the title here just to be headings, to be super explicit as to what's going on. And let me go ahead now and say H1, 1. And down here, let me say H2, 2. And down here, let me say H3, 3. Now, these are 3 new tags, H1, H2, and H3. By definition, H1 is typically big and bold. H2 is typically not quite as big, but still bold. H3 is not quite as big still, but still bold. And these are the default stylizations of these here tags that come with HTML. Let me go back to my other tab. Let me click back. So I now see my new file, headings.html. Let me click on headings.html. And now, even though it's still nonsensical Latin-like text, at least it's starting to look pretty. Looks like a chapter of a book with some sections and subsections and so forth. That's because the browser now understands what it is I want of it. Now, you could simulate this by just literally typing the word 1 in its own paragraph, the word 2 in its own paragraph, the word 3 in its own paragraph, but it wouldn't be bigger and it wouldn't be bolder. And when it comes to the semantics of web pages, it's probably useful to use tags, in this case, like H1, H2, H3, because it kind of indicates the relative importance of the text. Like this is the beginning of the text, this is maybe some finer detail, and then this is the finest detail. It might actually help search engines, or heck, even AI nowadays, understand that these are different sections in your text. And we'll soon see there's even other tags you can do to be even more helpful to the browser and search engines and AI. Well, how about something else? Let's move away from big blobs of nonsensical text, and let's do something with a chunk of nonsensical lists. Let me go into my terminal window, create a new file called list.html, and let me copy paste my hello code from earlier just to save some steps. And let me go ahead and rename the title to list in this case. And let's just have a list of 3 things: foo, bar, and baz. If you've never heard these words before, they're sort of go-to computer science words when you just want some random placeholders. They mean nothing per se. But foo, bar, and baz are go-to default words like X, Y, and Z for mathematicians. All right, this looks like a nice, pretty list. I've indented it, which looks great. But if I go back to my other tab, hit back, and I click on list.html, I think you probably know where this is going. Just like the paragraphs, we just get one big paragraph of foo, bar, baz. We don't get foo on one line, bar on the next line, baz on the third. Well, why is that? Well, just as before, the browser seems to be ignoring white space, beyond single white spaces. In fact, I can try to be really explicit, like please give me some breaks between these lines. But if I go back to my other tab, click reload, it just canonicalizes multiple spaces into a single space, for better or for worse. So if I really want a list, I need to tell the browser that I want a list. And one way I can do that is as follows. Let me delete that temporarily, and let me do UL for unordered list, which means I'm going to get a bulleted list with little circles next to each word. Let me then use an LI tag for list item and type foo inside of the first. Let me type another LI tag and bar for the next one, and then a third with baz. And again, VS Code is auto-completing, which is why I'm able to type the close tags so quickly. But I've got now foo, bar, and baz inside of LI tags, which in turn are inside of a UL tag. Now, let me go back to my other tab, click reload, and now we have a bulleted list of items, one at a time. Well, what if I want to number this list? Well, I could certainly just go in here and start manually writing 1 and 2 and 3, but you could imagine that getting a little annoying over time, because if you need to reorder the list or add things to it, like it's just minorly annoying to have to maintain numbers for lists of things. Like this is what software is good at. This is an easy fix, and you might guess where I'm going with this. If I want to move from an unordered list, which is just bullets by default, to an ordered list, which is numbered, I can change the UL to an OL in both places so that my start tag and end tag still match. I can go back to my other tab, click reload, and what's going to happen by default now is, I get 1 and 2 and 3. And long story short, there are actually techniques whereby you can change this behavior using attributes to not just be these Arabic numerals, but you can use Roman numerals or other symbols that browsers are designed to support. And it all just kind of happens for you, which is great because if you're writing something like an outline for a paper or the like, you don't really want to have to think about all of those numbers, just like Google Docs and Microsoft Word. Like the software should figure that out for you. And indeed, HTML can do just that. All right, how about one other here? This time, let me go ahead and cut a corner and open a file I created in advance just to save a few keystrokes. Let me close most of those files for now. Let me go ahead and copy from my source 8 directory a file I brought with me called table.html. And let me open this up in its own tab. And you'll see this file here that demonstrates a table. And indeed, I know that because I have atop this file that I wrote in advance something called a comment. We've seen comments in C with //. We've seen comments in Python with hash symbols. In HTML, a little weirdly, you can write comments with open bracket, exclamation point, dash dash. Then you write your comment, and you finish your thought with another dash dash, close bracket, but no additional exclamation point. Why these keystrokes? Well, the humans who designed this probably figured, who is ever going to type that sequence of keystrokes? Like, that's what we'll use for our comments tag. As an aside, if you ever actually want to write those patterns of characters, there's a way to escape those things, as we've seen in other languages as well. But let's focus on the juicy part here. What's inside the body of this here page? Apparently something called a table. And a table, by that we mean tabular data, like in a spreadsheet or in a database table. TR, I'll tell you, is short for table row, TR. TD, a little less obvious, but it's short for table data. So it's kind of like the cell in that row. And the fact that there are 3 table data elements inside of this one table row element means that there's going to be 3 cells, or really 3 columns from left to right, inside of this row. Below that is going to be another table row, inside of which are 3 more cells, 4, 5, 6, as their contents. Then 7, 8, 9. Then, curiously, an asterisk, a 0, and a pound symbol. So where are we going with this? Well, if you're imagining in your mind's eye a telephone that has buttons and labels, it seems like I've just been laying out rows and columns of numbers you'd see on your cell phone or an old-time landline phone. Well, let's still open this. Let me go back to my other tab, click back. Now you see table.html, and this isn't going to be all that pretty, but it is tabular data. And if I zoom in with Command+ here in my browser, you can see that this is laid out rather like a phone pad. Now, this is not a super compelling use, but you can imagine actual tabular data, maybe data that came from a database, maybe Google, in fact, when they implemented Google Sheets, or Microsoft when they implemented Office 365 in the cloud for Excel, maybe that's how they're laying out all of your data in your browser as it is. Underneath the hood, they are using, of course, HTML, but specifically table tags like this. Now, as an aside, they're probably doing even fancier things than that nowadays, but they certainly could use TR tags, TD tags, and these table tags as well. All right, enough about text. Let me actually go back to VS Code here. Let's close table.html, and let's do something with an image. In fact, let me go ahead and grab a file called maybe bridge.png, which is a portable network graphic version of the bridge with which you're now familiar, that we ran a number of filters on in the past. And this is now in ping format because BMP format, which we used in a previous problem set, tends not to be used on the web or supported necessarily by browsers, but pings are, GIFs are, JPEGs are, and potentially a few other formats as well. So I'm pretty good going with portable network graphic. We're good to go. So let's create a web page that actually includes this image, because at the moment I'm just showing you the image. I'm not actually embedding this image in a web page like Google or other websites would. So let's do this. Let's close that tab. Let's open a new file called image.html. Just to save some keystrokes, let me copy paste my hello world example again, changing the title to image. And in the body of this page, instead of any text, let's actually put an image from Harvard University. Let me go ahead and use open bracket IMG for short. Source equals quote unquote bridge.png. So in this case, we have a couple of new things going on here. We've got a new tag, of course, IMG, which is short for image. Why? It was just faster to type for humans than image, so they called it 3 letters instead of 5. Source is representative of another attribute. We saw an attribute earlier, lang equals en. Well, it turns out that the image tag, if you read its documentation or listen to me now, has an attribute called source, src for short, that allows you to specify the source of an image that you want to display in the page. But somewhat differently here, the image tag that I've written has no close tag, no end tag. I could do this, but frankly, open bracket / image, but frankly, this seems a little unnecessary, if not confusing, and it is technologically unnecessary. It turns out that some tags can be empty in the sense that they don't need a close tag, and an image kind of makes sense, right? Unlike a head of the page, the title of a page, the body of a page that start over here and maybe end down here, an image is either there or it's not. Like you can't start showing the image and eventually stop showing the image. Like it's either there or it's not. So you don't really need an end tag for certain start tags. An image is among the examples. If now I go back to my table here and click back to see my directory index, there is not only my ping, but also my image.html page. And if I click on this, it's not all that different from looking at the image itself, but apparently this is a pretty high resolution photograph that we took. I haven't done anything to resize it. And so what I'm seeing is a web page inside of which is this entire image. So that's okay, but I'm going to need eventually some techniques for shrinking this down. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. CSS, another language, is going to be one of our solutions to that there problem. But of course, things can go wrong. For instance, suppose that I mistyped this and I wrote bridge without the E, and I go back to this page and reload. That's, of course, a typographical error, and I see this broken icon. And you might have seen this on the real web. Sometimes images are broken because it's essentially a 404 happening underneath the hood. And in fact, the image just cannot be found. So if I want to help the user with this for a number of reasons, I can actually do this. Let me add an alt attribute for alternative and say something like Harvard University. In other words, in the event this image can't be displayed, go ahead and at least show the user some explanatory text. Better still, if someone is blind or they are using a screen reader to help them hear what is on a web page that they otherwise can't see, the alt attribute's value can be spoken aloud to someone with a screen reader so they know exactly what the image is that everyone else can see, so they can still appreciate what the contents of this web page are. If I go back to my tab here, in this case, it's still a typographical error, but at least now people with and without screen readers can see what this image is supposed to be. And even if I fix the typographical error and reload the page, if someone can see the image, they now will. But if someone's using screen reader software, which for those unfamiliar is software that looks at a web page and tries to describe in English or some other human language what is on the web page, now we have helped that device be all the more accessible as well. So you might have 0 or 1, or now it seems 2 attributes on a given tag. All right, well, what else can we do in terms of media? Well, there's something else we can do here, and I'll just show you this one and let you play around with it online if you'd like. In my source 8 directory, I've actually got a video file called video.html as well as video.mp4. And if I open the former of those, you'll see a page I wrote in advance that shows another technique about HTML. At the end of the day, we still only have tags and attributes. So like fundamentally, we've not really pushed ourselves too far here, but notice that there's a video tag in HTML that does come with two attributes at least, one called controls, one called muted. The controls attribute just means please show the user like a play button and a pause button and maybe some other things. The muted attribute means literally that, mute the audio by default. And that tends to be a good thing because nowadays browsers are pretty defensive against advertisements and annoying advertisements like videos auto-playing on websites. So you can ensure that your video will still auto-play, but without bothering the user. So you can mute the volume at least by default. But what's worth noting for our purposes is that some attributes apparently don't even need values. There's no equal sign, there's no quotes, which in some cases are necessary to specify the language of this page is in English, but some attributes indeed do not need values. And even if they do, you can use, as in Python, single quotes or double quotes, and sometimes no quotes at all, but I would get into the habit still stylistically of using double quotes for consistency as I have. But as for the rest of this, a source tag exists, which you can put inside of the video tag. It itself has, confusingly, a source attribute, SRC for short, as well as a type attribute, which indicates what type of video are you trying to play for the user. So I'll wave my hands at some of that media, but you're welcome to play that page and open it on your own and even unmute it to see what I've otherwise shown. But let's now make the web all the more interactive. Let me close that example. Let me go ahead and open a new file called link.html and start making the hyperlinks with which we're all familiar. Clickable links in web pages, which is what makes the web itself. Let me cut some corners here and copy paste my hello world example into link.html. Let me change the title to link just so we know what's what. And let's actually make a page that has a genuine link to Harvard's, to maybe that image of Harvard called image.html. I could say something like this. Visit Harvard, period. Now this of course is just text, so this is not that interesting, but just to make sure we're on the same page, let me click back. Let me go to link.html, and you'll see that I've called it link.html, but there's no link there. I can click Harvard all I want, but nothing actually happens. So let's make it a link. What do I want to link to? Well, I could link to Harvard's website, but I already have a picture of Harvard. Let's try linking to a page relative to this one. Let me go ahead and open a new tag called the anchor tag. A for short. Let me use its attribute called href, which is a little arcane, but it stands for hyperreference, the destination of this link. Let me add some quotes and say image.html, close quote, close tag. And then notice VS Code's trying to be helpful, but sometimes it doesn't know what I intend. So I'm going to delete the end tag, move my cursor over, and paste it at the end and finish my period there, just because I want everything to be balanced. And now, even though this one looks a little more cryptic, this is now the beginning of hyperlinking pages on websites. If I go back to my other tab, click reload, now I see the familiar underlined text, which of course signals in many web pages that this here is a link. If I hover over it, it's going to be a little small, but in the bottom left-hand corner of my browser, which is Chrome, I can actually see that this will lead me to a page called image.html. And indeed, if I click on Harvard for real, I get back to image.html. And the URL in my browser has changed from link.html to image.html. So this is what's known as a relative link, whereby I'm linking from one of my own pages to another of my pages. They're in the same folder, so I don't need to mention any folder names. The server just knows what I want. So that's then a link. But what if I want to link to an actual URL and not just a relative page like Harvard's own website? Well, that I can do too. I can change the value of this href attribute, and I could just do harvard.edu. Unfortunately, this is not going to work. The values of hrefs in a web page, if they're going to be full-fledged URLs, have to be actual URLs, protocol and all in this case. And so I'm going to do https://www.harvard.edu. And heck, I'm going to include the trailing slash even though I don't strictly need it. And technically speaking, I could omit the protocol if I want the same protocol to be used. But in general, I'm going to link to the full-fledged URL of harvard.edu here. I'm going to go over to my image tab. I'm going to kick back to go back to my link tab. I'm going to reload to make sure I get the latest HTML in my browser. And if I hover over this now, super subtle, but in the bottom corner of my browser now, this indeed leads me to harvard.edu. And if I click that, we should see the familiar forests that we saw a little bit ago. And now this is an external link, not a relative link, that I've now implemented in this web page. All right, let me click back. And let me reveal one other feature now of those so-called developer tools. Previously, I opened up developer tools when I wanted to play around with HTTP, the protocol that just gets the web pages from browser to server and back. But now it turns out I'm going to use another feature of my developer tools by right-clicking or control-clicking anywhere on my page or going through the main menu. I'm going to click Inspect. And now Inspect makes a little more sense because now I'm literally inspecting the web page itself. Notice at left here is a visualization of the underlying HTML of this web page. And some of it's hidden, but I'm going to click the little triangles to reveal the rest of it. And you will see essentially at left here under the Elements tab in Chrome a list of all of the elements that compose this web page. And again, an element is everything between an open tag and a close tag. So in this case, I am seeing a very pretty printed version of my own source code. And some things are broken out onto different lines just to make clear that here's some text, here's a link, here's some other text, both of which are inside of this body tag. And notice too, as I hover over things, Chrome, just to be helpful, because if I'm a developer, I want some help here, I can see in light blue what I am hovering over in my HTML being mirrored in the actual body of the page. If I hover over the body, I see everything to the body as well. Now, what I can take away from this is the following. This here is my web page, and it's very pretty printed. If I close this tab, I can see my same code in another way. If I right-click or control-click, I can also go to View Page Source. View Page Source is a feature that's been in browsers for years, and you can see the same code, but exactly as it came from the server. I happen to be pretty nitpicky, so it's all nicely indented as well. But this is a static version of the page, whereas the developer tools allows me to actually poke around with things. In fact, let me close this tab. Let me re-click again on Inspect. And watch this. If I want to poke around here, I could actually go into the developer tools and temporarily, without even going back to my terminal window, I can click on or double click on anything in this page, and I can actually change it in real time. Like I can change Harvard to Harvard University and then hit Command Enter. And in this case, I can change the contents of the web page. But curiously, that has not changed anything on the server, because this makes clear the point that once the browser has requested a web page from the server and downloaded that virtual envelope inside of which is the original version of link.html, that's what the browser is going to keep in its memory. You can change your copy of that page all you want, but it doesn't affect the server at all. The browser gets a copy of what's on the server. In fact, we can take this feature out for a spin, seemingly maliciously, but not in a way that has any effect. In fact, let me pull up not just harvard.edu, but specifically the admissions page for Harvard College, and scroll down here, and you'll see this advertisement toward the end, why Harvard? Well, notice that if I want to see the underlying HTML of this page, I can see it in a couple of ways. I can right-click and choose View Page Source, and it's going to look like way more code than we've written to date. This is me scrolling through all of the HTML that composes the admissions website's HTML at Harvard. There's a lot there, but it's going to follow that same pattern of tags and attributes. Or I can kind of pretty print it by going to Inspect, going to the Elements tab, and there, notice, is the exact same content, even though I was scrolling through it super fast, but it shows you everything pretty printed, so you can kind of poke around. More importantly, I can click on any part of the page with my Control key or two fingers and select Inspect, and what's nice is that Chrome, and really any browser, will jump to the specific HTML in the browser's memory that corresponds to that part of the page. The upside of this is I can actually infer, how did Harvard make this web page? How did they structure their HTML? Now, we haven't talked about all of these tags yet, but notice that there's all of these div tags, div, there's a section tag, but there are some familiar ones. Here's an h2. Harvard is using an h2 tag for why Harvard. Here's a ul down below for some kind of unordered list. But notice here I can be a little playful here, and maybe we should nudge people to go to Yale instead. Let me change in the Elements tab, Harvard to Yale, hit Enter, and now I seem to have hacked Harvard's website, and it suddenly says, why Yale instead? But of course, this changes nothing on the server because this too is a copy. And the moment I reload Harvard's website, I get a fresh copy of what's actually on the server. So what's the value here? Well, one, Pedagogically, it's just a useful mechanism, these developer tools, for understanding and learning how a website is structured if you want to do something similar yourself. As a developer tool, frankly, sometimes it's a lot faster to just mock things up in the developer tools, decide, okay, I like how this looks, and then go over to your actual HTML and make the changes for real. It's a faster way of iterating, and it's also a helpful way of diagnosing certain problems that we might otherwise run into. All right, but there's still a danger here. Speaking of Harvard and speaking of Yale, let me go ahead and close that tab there and return to the HTML of link.html. It turns out that the attacks with which you're familiar in the real world, namely phishing attacks, are all too easily waged via HTML alone. To be phished typically means to receive some kind of spam email that's trying to trick you into clicking on a link that purports to be legitimate, but is really taking you to some adversary, some bad guy's website that's trying to steal your credit card information, your username, your password, or something like that. And those emails in Gmail, in Outlook, and other tools, they themselves are using HTML. Anytime you get an email that's not just black and white text, but has colors and maybe images and formatting, it's using HTML. So HTML is used not only for web pages, not only for mobile apps, but also for emails as well. And here's how easy it is to unfortunately deceive users. Suppose that I still have a link here to Harvard, but I actually changed the actual href to be yale.edu. If I go back to my actual browser here and close my developer tools and click reload, the page still says, like the HTML, visit Harvard, period. And this is super subtle, but if I hover over this link in the bottom corner of my browser now, I'm actually going to be led to yale.edu if I click this link. In fact, if I actually do that, voila, now I'm actually at yale.edu. So not a big deal in this case. I'm just sending one student from one place to another. But you could imagine making a website that looks like a bank's website, that looks like PayPal's website, that looks like something legitimate, such that when I click on a link, no one's really looking in the bottom left-hand corner of their browser all the time. You could all too easily trick a user into visiting a page and maybe filling out a form on a page that they didn't actually intend. And we say this not to empower you to do such things, but the opposite, to detect when such behavior is happening. And frankly, getting into the habit of hovering over links that you're a little suspicious about is probably a good practice. But for today, know just how easily these threats can be waged and why there are so many of these threats to us online. It boils down to these basic fundamentals. Now, all that said, we haven't even done anything dynamically. Every web page we've made thus far has still been very static, like content I have made in advance, and you can reload all you want. It's always going to look the same from the server again and again. But how about we revisit how URLs work, not just to serve up static content, but dynamic content as well. It turns out that besides having folder names and file names at the end of URLs, you can also have a question mark in URLs, and then key value pairs, literally with an equal sign in between them. We've seen key value pairs all over the place, most recently in things like dictionaries, for instance. But in this case here, we have a canonical format for how you can actually provide input from a browser to a server, typically that's typed in via a form. So for instance, let me actually open up a brand new tab here. Let me go to google.com, just the main page that doesn't come with my browser. And I'm going to go ahead and type in something like cats, C-A-T. Now, ignoring the fact that there's a whole lot of autocomplete going on here, let me hit enter. And let me emphasize what my URL, we can be distracted for a moment by the cute cats on the top of the page. But let's then zoom in on the top of the page here, where we'll see a very long URL, most of which, frankly, I don't understand, and probably only Google employees would understand what everything is in this URL. But let me delete most everything except the essence of this URL. And what I've left at the top of my browser is only https://www.google.com/search, which is the path, $Q equals cats. It turns out, way back in 1999, when Larry and Sergey founded Google and created their very first search page, they had a text box just like this one, but more simple in design. And if you filled out that text box with one or more words and hit enter, you submitted a query to the server for which you want to search, Q for short. And so all that form needs to do when you hit enter is change the URL, it would seem, to take that user input in a standard format. Q equals cats. something equals something, something equals something. In fact, if there's multiple such parameters, as these are called, just like in functions, you can separate them with ampersands. But the question mark just means to the server, hey server, here come some key value pairs, otherwise known as HTTP parameters. When I hit enter, the search results are actually going to be exactly the same. Most of the other stuff in the URL is probably for tracking purposes, so Google can keep track of what I'm searching for and what I'm clicking on. But in essence, if we distill the URL to just question mark Q equals cats after search, we have provided user input to this here page. And what's cool about that is the following. Normally, the canonical URL might be as simple as this, or it might actually have two key values in pairs, which indeed can be separated by these here ampersands. I think I can take advantage of this here feature and implement like my own version of Google. Let me do this. That's kind of it for HTML. Like there's bunches of other tags and attributes out there, but those are really for an online tutorial or book or reference or some other source to just pick up what more vocabulary there is. At the end of the day, it's just more tags and more attributes following this shared structure. So for now, I want to make things more dynamic, leveraging my knowledge of just that. Let me go back into my VS Code. Let me create my own page called search.html, enter. Let me save a few keystrokes by copying and pasting my hello world code and changing the title to search. Let me get rid of the body here, and let me begin to create my very own form using literally a form tag, F-O-R-M, space, and then here I'm going to close the tag immediately. Inside of this form element now, let me go ahead and create an input whose name equals Q. And inside of this form element, let me additionally add an input whose type equals submit. And we'll see what this gets us first. Let me go back to my other tab, click back to see my directory listing of files, click on search.html, and this is super simple, but I seem to have the beginnings of an interactive web form, a big text box and a submit button by default that seems to be a form. Unfortunately, if I type in anything to this, cats, and then click submit, nothing actually happens. But if I go to my own URL here at the top, notice that I'm still on search.html, but question mark Q equals cats was automatically added for me by the browser as soon as I click submit. So let me go back and add a little more detail in my editable file. Let me specifically specify that the type of this text box is text, but that it turns out is the default. So I'm actually going to enhance that and make this a search box specifically. Let me go back to my browser and reload. And this is subtle, but if I now type in cats, notice that I get this little X here, which is just a user-friendly feature, which means now I can click on the X to clear that box. That is simply because I changed the type of this box from generic text to a search box, for which that feature is useful. I don't really like the idea of submit. I'd kind of like my button to say something about Google. So let me go back to my submit tag here and change the value of that input to be quote unquote Google search. Then let me go back to the page, reload, and now things are getting a little more interesting whereby I have a Google search button. It still doesn't do anything, but let me be more specific. When I submit this form, I want the method to be used, the verb to be quote unquote get. Somewhat confusingly, the convention is to use lowercase here, even though inside of the envelope I've demonstrated with curl that it tends to be capitalized in the actual HTTP protocol. But so be it. But get is actually the default, so I don't strictly need that. But what I do want to add here is an action. What action do I want this form to take when submitted? Well, I don't have a backend. I don't have a database. I have not searched the web ever with this here code space, but Google has. So let me use Google's backend, their servers and database to search for whatever Q is. Let me change the action value here to be https://www.google.com/search. So just the beginning of that URL without the question mark. Now let me go back to my search tab, reload, and now nothing visually seems to have happened, but if I type in cats now and click on this new and improved Google search button, watch what happens not only to my URL, but the contents of the page. I have just searched from my own web page for cats on google.com. In other words, by nature of how HTML forms work, specifically using the get method and the action of Google's own URL, my browser knows how to assemble all of those ingredients into a brand new URL that contains as the value of Q whatever I typed into that box. And heck, I can do this manually now, even though no one searches like this. I could just search for Q equals dogs, and now I get some adorable dogs as my search results here. But that's just because I now understand what these URLs are doing for me and how they are structured. If I zoom out and I go back to search.html, I can actually make some improvements here to that same form. You might have noticed that when I typed cats the second time, I actually saw it auto-completing as cats. There was a little popover there. If I don't want any autocomplete, there's an attribute for that. Autocomplete equals quote-unquote off. This will now disable the browser from remembering things that I've searched for before. I can also do this. Notice if I go back here to my search page and click reload, notice that with no hands on the keyboard, the box is there, the button is there, but my cursor isn't. I have to manually focus my cursor on that box, and then it gets highlighted in blue and I see the blinking cursor. That's not the best user experience, or UX, so to speak. Why you're going to make the user move their cursor and put the cursor where you want it to be anyway. So I can fix that. Let me go back to this same search box and let me add autofocus. And I don't actually need to give it a value, but if I now go back to the page and reload, watch, even without clicking on that text box, it's already highlighted and blinking because I've given focus, so to speak, to that there text box. Now, what is this text box? It's just a big white box. Well, if you read the documentation for, or listen to what I'm here saying about the input tag, you can also have a placeholder attribute that can contain any text you want, like query, for instance, quote unquote. If I now go back to this page, reload once more, now you see in gray text inside of the box sort of explanatory instructions as to what I'm looking for. And as soon as I start typing CATS, query, goes away. So that too is a feature you've probably seen in browsers that's just the result of someone having used the right HTML tags and attributes. Now, I've been a little deliberate here. I have alphabetized all of my attributes, if only because it helps me personally skim things from left to right and know if I've missed something that I intended. But strictly speaking, there's no official ordering to any of these attributes. You can put them left to right, right to left. They don't need to be alphabetically sorted. But stylistically, this is indeed what I myself tend to do here. Let's take a look at one more use of forms that will allow us to introduce another feature that's present not only in HTML, but in other programming languages as well, including, in fact, Python. So let me go ahead and create a new file here called register.html. And let's just imagine that we're trying to create a web page via which someone can register for something, a website, a sport, or anything else. And what I'm going to do in register.html is save a few keystrokes and copy my search code into register.html, and I'm going to change the title to register, and I'm going to get rid of the form as a starting point here. Let me close my terminal, and inside of this form, let's just create the beginnings of a registration form. But unlike the Google example, I'm not going to bother trying to submit this anywhere. That'll be a goal for another time. But let me go ahead and in this form create an input. For which autocomplete is off, like before, for which the field is auto-focused, and you should only have one autofocus field, otherwise the cursor doesn't know where to go. Let me specify that I want this input to be someone's email address, because after all, I want this to be a registration page. So the placeholder text I'm going to be using is email, so they know what to type. And then the type of this field, for now, is just going to be text. And then I'm going to go ahead and have a submit button, but it turns out you can have different types of buttons, and one other way to express a submit button is literally with an HTML element called button, for which the label here will be register. So long story short, there's different ways to implement buttons. Here is now a second way. Let me now go back to my other tabs. Let's close the tabs. Let's hit back to get to my directory index, and let's now click on register.html. So very similar in spirit to my search form, but now I'm clearly asking for an email with a registration button. However, I could try to register with anything here. In fact, if I'm not paying attention, maybe I'll just type my name like I always do in these examples and click register. And even though nothing technically happened, notice my URL did change, so the form was submitted, because email equals David is appearing there, but that was not an email address. And it would be nice if the browser says, no, that's not an email address, you cannot submit that form yet. But if this is just a text box, it's going to tolerate any kind of text. But as you might know from Microsoft Office and Google Forms, you can certainly validate forms in those kinds of software. Certainly we could do so in HTML. Well, we can in a couple of ways. Let me go back to my HTML, and let me change the type of this input to be not text, not search, but email. And it turns out that this is one of the officially supported types of inputs nowadays, where the browser will now know that, okay, before I can let the human submit this form, I better check that they're typed in an email. So let me reload this page. Let me again foolishly try to type in just my name, not my email, and click register. And now notice I'm getting admonished by the browser. This is a default pop-up that's saying, please include an @ in the email address. David is missing an @. So obviously I've not typed an email address, so let me fix this.